In 18th century Europe, the term Enlightenment referred to an age of social revolution, favoring reason over superstition, tolerance over persecution, and free expression over censorship. The Enlightenment fundamentally changed European civilization and led to its transformation from the medieval pious world to the modern secular one. The so-called enlightened despots, the rulers Catherine the Great, Frederick the Great, and Joseph II, used their power to institute dramatic reforms on their societies from the top down. Nowhere did this process go on more dramatically and boldly than in Austria under Joseph II. While France remained conservative and rigid in this era, descending into later turmoil and collapse during the French Revolution, Austria experienced a radical revolution imposed by its emperor. However, one of Joseph's most important legacies was his being a patron of the arts, sponsoring one of the greatest musicians of all time, Mozart. A child prodigy, Mozart studied music and began performing at a young age. By adulthood, he had become one of the major musical minds of his era, and though he died of illness at a young age, produced over 600 works and left one of the most significant legacies in the history of music. Before Joseph II came to the throne, he was preceded by the reign of his mother, Maria Theresa. Her able government set the foundation for his political absolutism in the later part of the 18th century. Without her reign, he would not have been able to implement the radical reforms of his rule. Formerly, in the mid-18th century, the Austrian Empire found itself in a crisis. After the reigns of two brothers, Joseph I and Charles VI, the ancient Habsburg dynasty, which dated back to its castle in Switzerland in the 11th century, went extinct in the male line. The brothers had tried to sire a male heir, but both failed. The end of their house in Austria followed their prior extinction in Spain, something that had occurred at the beginning of the 18th century. Charles VI had given birth to 3 daughters, and understanding the likelihood of their succession, made efforts to ensure a peaceful transfer of power. His realm followed what was called Salic law, the ancient law of inheritance by which the throne passed to males. Had the law been followed, a partition of the Habsburg Empire would have occurred, the throne passing to the husbands his daughters were married to. Wanting to secure his family's legacy, he decreed what was called the Pragmatic Sanction, consolidating all his crowns into one, and naming his daughter Maria Theresa as his sole heir. Yet this was a major political act. Requiring recognition, he had to go from court to court across Europe to receive support from the other powers. The British demanded that he shut down the Ostend Company, a successful East Indian trading company for Austria, which was based in modern-day Belgium. To receive recognition from Spain, he had to end the Habsburgs' claim to their throne. He granted economic concessions to the Dutch, gave the French free hands in Italy, and distributed lands and titles to receive recognition from the princes in Germany. Prophetically, Eugene of Savoy, one of history's great military geniuses, and at that time a field marshal of the Habsburg Empire, said the best guarantee of the sanction would be a strong army. On the emperor's death, Maria Theresa succeeded to the throne, and the empire immediately descended into turmoil. The other powers, sensing weakness, reneged on the agreements they made with their father and looked on the insecure Austria as predators. Frederick the Great of Prussia invaded and seized Silesia, while France and the smaller German states stood in solidarity with him. With aid from Russia, Britain, and her Hungarian subjects, Maria Theresa was able to win the so-called War of Austrian Succession and secure her throne. Yet she had to accept the loss of Silesia, and consequently a sharing of power with Prussia. In another video, we explored the legacy of this, examining how Prussia later transformed into Germany. While female rulers had reigned over states before, like Elizabeth in England, Maria Theresa's succession was a dramatic change. Despite her sex, she reigned conservatively and autocratically, accepting counsel from a group of advisors. Her policies focused on strengthening the state and ensuring a strong monarchy, though she did support the Enlightenment if it aided Austria, such as in instituting a policy of universal primary education. Fertile, she gave birth to a large family, wanting to do so to secure her legacy. Technically the last Habsburg, like Victoria was the last Hanoverian. We still call the dynasty that succeeded her the Habsburgs, even though they really transitioned into being the House of Lorraine. Due to the unique power and longevity of the Habsburgs, they contrived a form of matrilineal succession for themselves and came to call themselves the House of Habsburg-Lorraine. One of Maria Theresa's children of significance was her daughter, Marie Antoinette. After the War of Austrian Succession, she traveled to France and married the Dauphin, the future king, Louis XVI. Sofia Coppola, daughter of Francis Ford Coppola, made an art house film dramatizing this, showing the luxurious lifestyle the Queen enjoyed, and how insulated she was from the sufferings of the lower class. The marriage of Marie Antoinette and Louis constituted a diplomatic revolution. While Austria and France had been rivals for hundreds of years, this new relationship resulted in them forming an alliance. This relieved considerable tension for the Austrians and resulted in a secure continent for France, which was now able to focus on its colonial conflicts with the British. Maria Theresa would attempt a war with Prussia, one of the earliest global conflicts called the 7 Years' War. Despite assistance from France and Russia, the genius and good fortune of Frederick the Great allowed his state to survive. This established the idea of German dualism, that the smaller states of Germany could look to either the cultural and diplomatic power of Austria or the austere and martial Prussia as a leader of the Germans. As a ruler, Maria Theresa was intolerant of Protestants and Jews, viewing them as subversive elements in her empire. During her reign, she expelled the Jews from Prague and banished Austria's Protestants to remote Transylvania. Her other child of historical importance, her son Joseph II, ruled with her in her later years, and often stood in opposition to her policies, their difference in opinion recalling the difference between Bismarck and Frederick III in Prussia. While Maria Theresa was a supporter of tradition, her son was influenced by the growing movement in Europe, the Enlightenment. Associated first with England and then France, the ideas of the Enlightenment came to spread throughout the continent. In England, Thomas Hobbes was one of the first figures of the movement, presenting an apology for monarchic government, defending it with a new political thesis called the social contract. The idea of this was that there was an unspoken agreement made between a ruler and their subjects. The population of a state gave their monarch fidelity and loyalty, and in return, the ruler ensured stability, order, and security. Hobbes' vision of the social contract was limited and conservative, but his successor in England, the thinker John Locke, expanded on the concept and brought it to its modern definition. For Locke, the ruler was expected to deliver far more, defending the subject's rights to life, liberty, and property. One of Locke's most radical ideas, one that would find its culmination in the American and French revolutions, was that legitimacy derived from the people. This meant if a monarchy didn't deliver on its obligations, it became a right of the people to overthrow them and install a new government. In France, Montesquieu and Rousseau elaborated on these ideas, suggesting the ideas of limited power in government, checks and balances, and republicanism. The thinker Voltaire challenged social convention, turning reason against superstition. Favoring free speech and tolerance, Voltaire was a radical in his time, supporting a form of ethical atheism and challenging the power of the church and its oppressive hold over society. These ideas spread and were adopted by monarchs like Catherine the Great and Frederick the Great. Nowhere were they internalized more, however, than in Austria, where Maria Theresa's son, Joseph II, pushed the empire through a radical internal transformation. While Frederick and Catherine supported moderate reforms, and Frederick was a patron of Voltaire, neither reproached the reformist ambition of Joseph II. Having been co-ruler with his mother, Joseph had a long education in governance by observing her. While ruling with her, he had to defer to her policies, but he protested against them frequently. He nurtured grievances and a fervor to transform his empire around the new principle of reason when it came under his rule. As emperor, Joseph implemented a revolution from the top down. On taking the throne, he reversed his mother's discriminatory policies, passing a patent of toleration that granted legal acceptance of Protestants and Jews. A rationalist, he put the church under state control, and wanting it to benefit society as a whole, abolished its contemplative orders and compelled the clergy to work in education, hospitals, and orphanages instead. Like his mother, he also tried to expand education to the public. Joseph went further than any other Enlightenment monarch in the scale of his ambitions. He abolished serfdom in the Austrian Empire and imposed taxes on the nobility for the first time, who were historically exempt. In the justice system, he imposed a new standard of equality before the law. He decreased censorship, tried to impose German as a national language, and recognized the plurality of languages in Austria as a long-term weakness that needed to be corrected. In administration, Joseph sought to simplify and reorganize the realms of the Habsburg Empire. Legally, Austria was actually a combination of personal unions, with each state, Bohemia, Hungary, Croatia, Belgium, and so on, having its own laws, rules of succession, and legislatures. While the Austrian emperor was the sovereign of each of these territories and unified them through his personhood, attempting to coordinate and govern them was always a struggle. Joseph II centralized the government and even moved the Czech and Hungarian crowns to Vienna to symbolize his act of political integration. In addition to these ambitions, Joseph was a patron of the arts, most famously sponsoring the composer Mozart. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was born in Salzburg, and at the behest of his musical father Leopold, began practicing music at the age of 5. A prodigy, by the time he was in his mid-30s, he had produced a great canon of works. He married Constanze Weber and had 6 children, though only 2 survived infancy. Mozart first met Joseph II in early youth, performing for him while being taken on a tour by his father. He later returned, creating 2 operas for the monarch explicitly, and several others at the behest of his court. Mozart famously created works for the emperor in the German language, supporting his national program. He left behind one of the great compendiums in the history of music, before dying at the age of 35. One of the most famous works that dramatizes Mozart's life is Milos Forman's film, Amadeus. It portrays a fictionalized version of the relationship between Mozart and his historical colleague, the Italian musician Antonio Salieri. The film elevates the life of Mozart into a piece of art, examining the major challenges he grappled with and the themes of his life. The plot explores the relationship between Salieri and Mozart, one of passion, envy, and adulation, raised into a beautiful exploration of the human condition. The film portrays Mozart's struggle for artistic integrity, one of the great challenges of an artist. The film also portrays the sublime, transcendental, and resplendent life of the musician. In Christianity, God is the creator and orderer of the universe. As a composer, Mozart takes on the human form of this role. Through his creations, he's able to devise his own music of the spheres, and through the performances he creates on the stage, present his own vision of the cosmos. The musician is portrayed as a unique figure, able to approximate his mind to God and express the idea that God is in music. The film begins with a Catholic priest, Father Vogler, visiting Salieri in the hospital at the end of his life. The narrator of the film, the plot emerges out of the story Salieri tells. Salieri is in the hospital after attempting suicide and blames himself for Mozart's death. This idea derives from real-life rumors about Salieri, although the historical figure denied them. When Father Vogler inquires, Salieri explores his life story, how he worked as the court musician for Joseph II, and received many honors and recognitions, Though he speaks pridefully of his accomplishments, Salieri is disappointed the priest doesn't know him, and Salieri has no popular reputation. He plays the priest several of his songs, seeing if any are recognizable. After each one, the priest explains he doesn't know it. Finally, Salieri plays one of Mozart's songs, one known to all of us, which the priest immediately recognizes. With bitterness, Salieri laments how the one song he knows wasn't his, but Mozart's. Played by F. Murray Abraham, Salieri is a complex character, one torn between a longing and appreciation for the transcendental on the one hand, and a human and fallible weakness for envy and resentment on the other. Salieri explains his early passion for music, but how his father didn't support him. He expresses jealousy over Leopold, Mozart's father, who compelled him to study and practice music from a young age. Salieri recounts his father telling him how Mozart had been turned into a traveling amusement for others, nothing to be jealous of. Set in the pious 18th century, a key conflict in the plot is that between Salieri and God. Throughout his life, Salieri repeatedly speaks to God, bargaining with him, negotiating with him, and trying to understand his plan in the world. In childhood, Salieri makes a pact with God, promising his industry and chastity if he can be a great musician. After this, Salieri devotes himself to the creation of music and advances quickly through his career, moving from Italy to Austria and eventually finding himself a place at Emperor Joseph's court. When Salieri first encounters Mozart's music, he's stunned by its beauty and elegance. He feels that Mozart lives up to his name Amadeus, one who's received the love of God, a brilliance appreciating brilliance. When Salieri reads Mozart's music, he perceives it as having a divine significance. Yet when Salieri meets Mozart in person, he's stunned by his character. This person who he thinks has the grace of God has none of the propriety, self-denial, or discipline of Salieri. On the contrary, he's inappropriate, childish, and crude. One of the ironies of the film is that though Salieri has been given all he wished for in youth, he fails to appreciate it, instead feeling his accomplishments are hollow whenever he compares himself with Mozart. One of Salieri's weaknesses is his embracing a life of self-denial. Convinced this is what God wants him to do, it impoverishes him of happiness and causes him to live in a kind of sexual resentment of Mozart. Mozart himself is a troubled character. Though famous and popular, he struggles financially, feels unappreciated, and has psychological issues due to his abnormal childhood. He expresses disappointment at his employer, the Prince Archbishop of Salzburg, trying to embarrass him to get himself out of his service. Mozart makes his way to Vienna, where he's granted an audience with the emperor. In this scene, Joseph shows his humble nature, sitting at the piano as Mozart enters and playing a welcome march for him. The emperor flatters Salieri by playing a piece of music he wrote for the occasion. When Mozart arrives, he shows his social impropriety, but on sitting at the piano, demonstrates his brilliance. He takes Salieri's march, and with the dynamic skill of a master, begins spontaneously editing it, adding to it and perfecting it. Mozart wins the envy of the Italians at court. Not only Salieri, but the other composers are threatened and jealous of Mozart's talent. Of the traditional school, they try to demean Mozart and block his career. The German courtiers recognize Mozart's talent, but give him good advice. Though the emperor likes him, they tell him he's arrogant, unwilling to follow rules and conventions, and insistent he's more talented than everyone. They counsel him to be more deferential and respectful when applying to work for the emperor. Despite this, Mozart is given commissions by Emperor Joseph, which instead of celebrating, Salieri becomes resentful of. When the emperor devises an idea for the National Theater, he invites Mozart for an audience. While Italian was the standard in opera for its beauty and elegance, as part of his national program, Joseph sought to make a work in the German language. When he expresses the idea to Mozart, he's pleased to learn he wants to do the same, though Mozart again expresses his impropriety, losing favor at court. As Salieri struggles with envy and inadequacy, there is a scene where he prays to God for guidance to help him create a great work, one of the caliber of Mozart. If you watch the scene carefully, he starts to be inspired, but is suddenly interrupted by a visitor who comes to meet him due to a previous act of jealousy he made toward Mozart. Fatally, this shows how Salieri suffers due to envy, failing to discipline himself from one of the deadly sins in Catholicism. Meanwhile, Mozart begins working on Figaro, an opera exploring social themes. Figaro is about two commoners who are oppressed and tyrannized by a privileged nobleman. When Joseph learns Mozart has been working on it, he explains he has banned productions of Figaro, as it ignites animosity between the classes, making a reference to his sister's growing experience in France. Yet Mozart is able to defend the work and get permission to make the opera. Meanwhile, Salieri receives a medal and a national commendation for the emperor for one of his works, a dream he always aspired for. Yet when Salieri asks Mozart for his opinion, he gives no praise for it. Given his faith in Mozart's talent, this hurts Salieri deeply, with both Mozart and Salieri having previously agreed the emperor has no ear for music and was a terrible judge of a work's quality. When the emperor comes to observe Mozart's abduction of the Seraglio, it bores him and he yawns as it's being performed. This dooms the opera to only a few performances, despite the amount of labor Mozart put in the work. Joseph tells Mozart his work is too many notes, not appreciating the work's complexity. Despite his auspicious happy marriage, Mozart has affairs. Though Salieri always observed virtue with his students, something expected at the time, he recognizes Mozart has slept with one of the opera singers that he was infatuated with. This causes him a lot of grief, which he recounts to Father Vogler. At a masquerade ball, Mozart entertains a crowd with his talent. He's asked to play his imitation of Salieri, and when he does, mocks his meanness and negativity, and dismisses his skill as an artist. Though Mozart likely doesn't mean this mean-spiritedly, Salieri internalizes it and interprets it as a personal mockery of him from God. Salieri's conflict with God escalates as the film goes on. Though Salieri has achieved fame, status, and social recognition, he feels worthless without the gift of Mozart. While Salieri tries to damage Mozart's reputation, in reality most of Mozart's fall comes from his own actions, like his reputation for sexual inappropriateness with his students. Losing favor at court, he becomes depressive, unstable, and withdrawn, drinking during the day, and wasting his wealth on alcohol, gambling, and dissolution. Mozart drives his family into poverty. His mother-in-law lambasts him, telling her daughter what a mistake it was to marry him, though this ends up inspiring Mozart to model a character in one of his operas after her. Despite the decline of Mozart's popular reputation, Salieri understands his brilliance, and as one of his admirers, secretly attends every performance he puts on. In Don Giovanni, Salieri recognizes Mozart, projecting the traits of his imperious father onto the stone figure who drags the titular character to hell. This portrayal shows Mozart's complex feelings about his childhood subordination and the stress of a lifetime of impositions made on him by his father. While Salieri was jealous of Mozart's upbringing, in Don Giovanni, you can see the difficult emotions Mozart feels about his youth. Though he became gifted and talented, being forced to perform at a young age had a psychic effect, creating an imbalanced and poorly adapted adult temperament. In disrepute, Mozart descends into increasingly more humiliating work, playing music to someone's dogs, and instead of working in the National Theater, starts playing popular music to proletarian crowds. Taking on a disguise reminiscent of his past father, Salieri begins visiting Mozart and hires him to make works for him. Though Salieri believes he is leading Mozart on a dark path and exploiting him to plagiarize his works, he's actually providing an income he desperately needs, Mozart having fallen into bankruptcy. Salieri claims he'll get his revenge against God by hiring Mozart to write his Requiem, then stealing it and playing it off as his own at Mozart's funeral. The Requiem would be Mozart's boldest work, exploring themes of mortality and divine judgment. Salieri believes his constant pressure on Mozart to finish the work is what drives him into illness, causes his health to decline, and results in his death. When Mozart falls ill at one of the popular theaters, Salieri sees him and arranges transport for him home. Salieri then sits with Mozart in his room, working on his final piece of music with him. It is here when Mozart's family sees him for the last time, before he finally passes away from the illness that had been plaguing him. When reflecting with Vogler, Salieri again compares his work to Mozart and feels a sense of envy, internalized shame, and inferiority. Salieri concludes believing himself a mediocrity, someone doomed to be forgotten, feeling that while Mozart is unacknowledged in his lifetime, due to his true merit, he'll have a legacy in eternity. Amadeus is filled with irony. Though Salieri claims to hate Mozart, on repeated viewings of the film, it's clear he actually feels the opposite. If not in words, the deeds of Salieri communicate his love for him. Throughout the film, the two have intimate meetings, confiding in each other, sharing their work, and comparing lives. In these meetings, Salieri acknowledges the art of Mozart, giving him the recognition he's wanted his whole life. One of the most important symbols of the film occurs only once, when Salieri, visiting Mozart in disguise, turns and we catch a glimpse of the opposite side of his mask. The scowling, joyless mask mimics Salieri's face in real life. Inverting this, the rear mask presents a smiling, benevolent face, reflecting Salieri's true inner feeling toward Mozart, which he's unable to articulate. While Salieri thinks he's slandering Mozart throughout the film, in reality his incompetence spoils most of his efforts to do so, and most of Mozart's hardships, financial and ethical, are a result of his own actions, not others. During the ballet, Salieri's impartiality helps Mozart restore music to the work, which Mozart thanks him for doing. When Mozart is bankrupt, Salieri thinks he's a manipulator, not understanding he's giving his friend an income he desperately needs. Salieri's final guilt of being responsible for Mozart's death is also untrue. When Mozart falls ill, the film emphasizes Salieri's role in helping him, instructing the others to pick him up when he faints, getting a stretcher to bring him outside, calling a carriage for him, and going home with him in person to assist him in bed. Partially recovered, the two then engage in the activity that brought them the most joy in their lives, the creation of music. Here in this collaboration, Salieri gets to participate in the divine work of Mozart, becoming a co-participant in creation. By working with him, he gets to gain an approximate understanding of the mind of God. There is some blackness in the history of Mozart and the Emperor. As we mentioned, Mozart died prematurely at age 35. His life cut short before he could experience the fullness of being a husband, father, and artist. In addition, the fate of the musical emperor was also unfortunate. Though Joseph was an ambitious reformer and implemented policies we take for granted today, his zeal resulted in a conservative backlash from the aristocracy and the church, two factions his monarchy was dependent on. His efforts to Germanize his subjects led to insubordination in Hungary, while his efforts to centralize power caused an actual revolution in Belgium. Many of his reforms would be unmade on his death, his more moderate brother Leopold succeeding him to the throne. After him, Austria became more conservative and took a further reactionary step backward under the imperious and incapable Francis II. Francis ruled over Austria during the French Revolution in the age of Napoleon. Under him, Austria will witness the decline of its power and the dissolution of the ancient Holy Roman Empire it presided over. Despite these truths, Mozart and the Emperor retain a great legacy. They sought to spread the Enlightenment and the truth that God is in music to the world.